was the beginning of summer and Presley Pereira decided to go to their local amusement park. It was around evening time, they took the bus there, as one does. When they finally arrived and saw how high the rides were and how crazy the rides were, they were like, you know what, maybe let's not do that. Turns out they got a fear of heights, so they decided to spend the night playing carnival games. But they played game after game after game and they always came out empty-handed, thinking, okay, maybe I'm just bad at monotonous fair games, maybe I should just go home and play video games. So after all their unsuccessful tries to win the prizes, there was one game that caught their eye. It was this old, dusty-looking machine isolated to a corner of the park. Looked like one of those fortune teller machines that you'd see in an arcade, kind of like Zoltar. The game didn't draw much attention from the fair, so they're like, okay, let's give it a try. The game was called Psychic Clown, and it had a creepy looking clown inside, and the clown was quite realistic looking, like you'd shoved a scare actor inside. So Presley put some spare change into the slot, pressed the start button, and the clown began talking. It said, ask me a yes or no question to uncover the truth and then press the start button. So they asked, okay, will I get a girlfriend by the end of the year? Hit the start button, the clown began to move and started laughing in a very disturbing way, and then eventually said, no. Presley was like, okay, well, this can't be accurate, it's just a fair game. But the sad reality was, clown was probably right. So Presley was like, you know what, let's try something else, something more personal. Dropped in more change, said, are my parents divorced? Granted, their parents had been divorced for like 10 years at that point, so pressed the button. Clown began doing its little laugh and eventually said, yes. Now at this point, Presley was like, I'm a little creeped out. I wonder, is this a fluke? Is this for real? Let's try again. So they're reaching in their pocket, let's see what change I got left, realize they've only got $2 left. This is supposed to be for bus fare home. But they were like, you know what, I'll call mom to come pick me up. So they used their last $2 or whatever, a couple of bucks on this psychic clown. They put the first dollar in, they were about to ask a question, but then the game wasn't working. So they, bopped it a couple of times and then the clown began to laugh again. But this time it seemed like the clown was malfunctioning. It was laughing uncontrollably, it started jerking its body back and forth, just kind of vigorously. And the movements were so crazy to the point where the clown started like banging his head against the glass, causing it to kind of crack. Now, Presley was like kind of in a freeze moment. You know, those reactions that you get? Everybody else that was walking by was just sort of laughing at Presley looking scared at this game, and they were kind of disturbed. They're like, okay, maybe it's a glitch, let's try this again, put some more money in, and they're like, hey clown, will my mom pick me up from the fair tonight? And the clown begins to do its creepy laugh, and then it said no. And here, folks, this is where things get creepy. So Presley got a call from their mom right after the clown said no. And the mom was like, hey, are you on your way home? And Presley was like, hey, can you come pick me up? Mom says, yes, I will. And then the call cuts off. They figured, okay, phone has poor signal, we're not gonna call back. Mom said yes. So Presley makes their way out of the carnival. They're laughing about how the clown's prediction was wrong, and they find a spot. They're gonna like sit here, wait for mom. So a few minutes of waiting turns into an hour, and they're trying to call their mom's number. They're like, okay, mom, where are you? The calls are going straight to voicemail. They send a text, nothing. Eventually they call their stepdad, and stepdad answers the phone and is like, hey, are you on your way home? And when Presley mentioned that they've been trying to get a hold of their mom, stepdad's voice suddenly got panicky and he's like, yeah, I'll get a cousin to come get you. So like another hour later, cousin finally shows up looking extremely distraught. Presley's like, hey, like what is going on? What do you know? The cousin mentioned that he had just finished dropping off Presley's stepdad at the hospital because Presley's mom got into a nasty car accident. So cousin and Presley speed to the hospital and find out that sadly Presley's mom had already passed on from her injuries. To this day, Presley still ponders on like, did I have a hand in the fates deciding the event of that night? Oh, that accursed psychic clown. Veteran circus performer Chris Steele has been swallowing swords for quite some time, but back in 2018 he was seriously injured after an act went horribly wrong. Known by stage name Captain Steele, he has appeared with his wife and fellow sideshow performer Elena Steele on America's Got Talent, Ripley's Believe It or Not, but at this fateful event in Atlanta, when he was swallowing 13 swords at once, which is an act he's done like 100 times, he wound up with a perforated esophagus. So in explaining what happened, Steele shared that during the trick he pushes 13 swords down into the esophagus, then he spins them 180 degrees and then up they go. That time though, instead of pushing through that, they pushed through the sidewall of the esophagus, pushed it about 16 inches down into the chest cavity, and then spun it 180 degrees. So it's a miracle that he only perforated his esophagus and somehow avoided hurting any of his internal organs. Now he went on to share that before the accident he'd had an exhausting day, he'd already done 2 other gigs, and then when he finally went to do this particular feat, seeing as this venue had very low ceilings, he dropped to one knee to swallow the swords, which changed the angle of the trick, which, Now, he did mention he successfully performed this feat many times over like 10 years prior, but that doesn't make any feat any less dangerous to pull off. He mentioned, you know the possibility is out there, and then when it happens, you know how dangerous and how bad it could be. And although his organs narrowly missed getting punctured, he did continue to suffer from internal injuries for quite some time after that day. But at the end of the day, he did mention to news outlets he was recovering well at the time. The doctors were saying he did make some progress. He has returned to performing. Now, despite the scary injury, Steele, who has been, once again, doing this for quite some time, he was like, look, I'll go back to performing, and he did. He mentioned it's what he was born to do. He had too much unfinished work to quit, and like, ask any sideshow performer. Even if they get hurt, they'll tell you the same thing. By the way, the captain holds the records for heaviest sword swallowed and the most swords swallowed underwater, which is something I would like to see. A magician was taken to hospital back in 2019 after reportedly being struck on the head with an arrow during an on-stage performance gone wrong. This entertainer, who works under the name One Crazy China, suffered this injury at the 2019 National Arts Festival in South Africa. He was appearing alongside magician Brendan Peele in a show titled Carnival Sideshow and Other Magical Things, where the crowd was sadly asked to leave the hall after the arrow bopped Lau on the head during an illusion. Now, festival organizers said that Lau had been taken to the hospital to get stitches to the back of the head, and the art organization's chief executive, Tony Lancaster, mentioned to news outlets that trauma counseling was available for anybody in the audience who needed it. He said in a statement, "We are informed that the crossbow did not penetrate his skull. The performer is fully conscious. The festival deeply regrets the incident and is in conversation with the performers to establish what went wrong with the illusion." Here's the thing though, co-star Brendan Peele told news outlets that the story had been blown out of proportion by local media outlets. He's like, "I was not responsible for an error." He mentioned there was a crossbow involved, but the illusion was structured so it was impossible to be truly, awful. Also, once again, Li Lao, which is the legal name of the performer, was the one who created the effect. Brendan was just an assistant in the illusion. So at the time, the media was kind of painting it out like it was, really bad. And while the performers weren't going to go behind the curtain and explain how the illusion worked, at the end of the day, it was an illusion. There was a slight mishap, but both performers took all necessary precautions just to be overly cautious. All was well on both sides. The rest of the shows were going to continue as scheduled, but Brendan went on to say the entire story was blown way out of proportion and nobody originally reached out to the performers to make a comment. So in a statement that was obtained by news outlets, the performer who was injured said that they were all good and well following the minor mishap with the escape illusion. And they wanted to clarify, Brendan in no way was responsible or to blame and did not physically aim or hold the weapon during the stunt. The escape was something that he designed, he created. The two guys were not fully in direct harm's way. They did apologize for the scare, and they were overly cautious to make sure everybody was okay.
Starting off this list, we are talking about the death of Balder. Balder was the beloved son of Odin and Frigg, the shining god of light and purity, and he was cherished by all the gods in Asgard. Known for his beauty, wisdom, and fairness, Balder's presence brought joy and peace to the heavens. However, this idyllic existence was soon overshadowed by a series of dark and prophetic dreams that Balder began to experience. He started having ominous dreams of his own death. Concerned, Odin rode to the underworld to consult a wise seeress who confirmed that Balder was destined to die. Desperate to save her son, Frigg made every living and non-living thing swear not to harm Balder, except for what she thought was the insignificant mistletoe. Loki, ever the troublemaker, discovered this loophole. He fashioned a spear made from mistletoe and tricked Balder's blind brother Hoder into throwing it at him. The spear pierced Balder, killing him instantly. The gods were devastated, knowing this was a sign of Ragnarok, the end of the world. Frigg pleaded for someone to retrieve Balder from the underworld, and Hermod, Odin's son, volunteered. Riding Odin's horse Sleipnir, Hermod reached Hel, the realm of the dead, and begged for Balder's return. Hel agreed on the condition that everything in the cosmos weep for Balder. While almost everything did, a giantess named Tok, who was actually Loki in disguise, refused. Thus, Balder remained in the underworld, forever separated from the living. The gods held a grand funeral for him, setting his ship aflame and sending it to sea. The joyous halls of Asgard were plunged into deep mourning, and the grief of the gods was profound, for they had lost their most beloved member. Balder's death set off a chain of tragic events, leading to the onset of Ragnarok, the prophesized end of the world. The gods' sorrow was compounded by the knowledge that this was only the beginning of their doom. Balder's death signified the unraveling of the divine order, and the gods braced themselves for the impending chaos and destruction. Loki, the the orchestrator of Baldur's demise, soon found himself hunted by the gods. Realizing the gravity of his situation, he fled to a remote mountain and built a house with 4 doors to watch for approaching enemies. By day, he transformed into a salmon and hid in a river, resuming his true form at night. Odin, from his high throne, eventually discovered Loki's hiding place and led the gods to capture him. When the gods arrived, Loki was weaving a net but quickly burned it and turned back into a salmon to escape. Despite this cleverness, Loki was eventually caught by Thor, who grabbed him by his tail as he leapt towards the sea. The gods then took Loki to a cave where they bound him with the entrails of his son, who had been killed by his other son transformed into a wolf. They placed a venomous serpent above Loki's face with its poison dripping onto him. His wife Siguna stayed by his side, catching the venom in a dish, but when she emptied it, the venom would drip onto Loki, causing him unbearable pain and making the earth tremble. Loki remained in this torment until the day of Ragnarok. Buckle up for a wild and grim tale from Norse mythology: the slaying of the giant Keeling by the infamous dwarves Falyar and Galar. This story is a perfect example of the dark and often twisted nature of these ancient myths. So these two were no ordinary dwarves. They were cunning and ruthless and always scheming to get what they wanted. Their target this time was Keeling, a giant who, unfortunately for him, got caught up in their deadly plans. The two invited the giant to join them on a boat trip. Now Keeling, being a trusting giant, probably thought this was just a friendly little outing, but little did he know the dwarves had something far more sinister in mind. Once they were out to sea, the dwarves revealed their true intentions. They rowed Keeling out to deep waters and then, without warning, capsized the boat. Giants, despite their size, aren't exactly known for their swimming skills, so Keeling struggled and unfortunately eventually drowned, his cries for help echoing over the water. But of course, this little mischievous pair weren't done yet. Keeling's wife, worried about her missing husband, came looking for him. When she arrived at the dwarves' home, desperate for news, they concocted another vile plan. Fjalar and Galar told her that Keeling had died at sea, which was true, but obviously only half the story. When she broke down in grief, they took a massive millstone and dropped it on her head, killing her instantly. So why did they commit such heinous acts? Well, these dwarves weren't just motivated by mindless violence, they had a reason, albeit a very dark one. The crime against the giant and his wife was a part of their plot to obtain the precious mead of poetry. The magical mead was made from the blood of Kvasir, a wise being, and whoever drank it would gain the gift of poetry and immense wisdom. The story does not end there. Keeling and his wife had a son named Suttungr who was understandably furious when he learned of his parents' killings. Suttungr sought revenge and managed to capture Fjalar and Galar, threatening them with death. In a desperate bid to save their lives, the dwarves offered Suttungr the mead of poetry, which he accepted. So this tale of treachery and deceit eventually leads to another famous story: the cunning theft of the mead by Odin, the all-father of the gods. Okay, so when Suttungr returned home, he stored the mead in Nitbjorg, guarded by his daughter Gunnlod. Odin, always on the lookout for wisdom and power, devised a plan to steal the mead. Disguised as a laborer, he tricked 9 slaves into killing each other over a magical whetstone. Odin then approached Baugi, Suttungr's brother, and offered to complete the slaves' work in exchange for a drink of the mead. The brother agreed, but couldn't convince Suttungr to share the mead. Undeterred, Odin used a drill named Rati to bore into Nitbjorg and transformed into a snake to slip inside. He seduced Gunnlod, gaining access to the mead for 3 nights, during which he drank all of it. Transforming into an eagle, Odin fled with Suttungr in close pursuit. As Odin neared Asgard, he spat the mead into waiting vessels, though he accidentally let some fall, which became known as the Rhymster's share. The rest he delivered to the gods, securing the gift of poetry and wisdom for those truly deserving. Next we are talking about the dark saga of the Volsons. Volson was born from chaos but grew up to be a great king and married Hiod, the daughter of Jet Tun, and the maiden who had delivered the magical apple. They had 10 sons and 1 daughter, with the eldest twins being Sigmund and Signe. Volson built a grand hall around a massive tree. One day, Siggeir, the king of Gotland, came to ask for Signe's hand in marriage. Volson agreed despite Signe's objections. During the wedding feast, a mysterious one-eyed man, who everyone was pretty sure was Odin, thrust a sword into a tree, declaring it a gift for whoever could pull it out. Many tried, but only Sigmund succeeded. Siggeir, now married to Signe, offered to buy the sword, but Sigmund refused. Shortly after, Siggeir revealed his true nature and plotted to overthrow Volson. Despite Signe's warnings, Volson led his army to invade Gotland. In a grim and fierce battle, Volson and most of his sons were killed and the survivors were captured. Siggeir tied Volson's sons in the forest to die. Each night, a she-wolf came and killed one of them at a time until only Sigmund remained. With the help of honey given by a scout sent by Signe, Sigmund tricked the she-wolf into licking his face, and when she put her tongue in his mouth, he bit it off, and that was just enough to kill her, I guess. Signe, desperate for revenge, swapped forms and conceived a child with Sigmund. When the child was 10, he and Sigmund plotted their revenge. They snuck into Siggeir's hall but were captured. With the help of Sigmund's magical sword, they escaped and set fire to the hall, trapping Siggeir inside. Signe, choosing to die with her husband, walked into the fire as well. After Siggeir's death, Sigmund became a powerful ruler. He married Borgil, and they had a son named Helgi, ensuring the continuation of the Volson lineage. Next, we are talking about the binding of Fenrir. Loki had 3 monstrous children with the giantess Angerboda, the serpent Jormungandr, the death goddess Hel, and the terrifying wolf Fenrir. The gods, knowing these beings were destined to bring about chaos, took drastic measures. They tossed Jormungandr into the ocean, where he encircled the world, and they sent Hel to the underworld. Fenrir, however, was kept under their watch in Asgard, with only the brave god Tyr feeding him. As Fenrir grew alarmingly large, the gods decided that they couldn't just let him roam free, so they tried to bind him with various chains, pretending that it was a test of his strength. But Fenrir broke them all. Finally, they sought help from the dwarves, who crafted like a magical chain called Gleipnir. It was made from impossible things like the sound of a cat's footsteps, the roots of mountains, the breath of fish, and the spittle of a bird. When presented with Gleipnir, Fenrir sensed a trick and demanded one of the gods place a hand in his mouth as a show of trust. Tyr courageously volunteered, knowing that it would end up costing him his hand. Once Fenrir realized that he couldn't break free, he bit off Tyr's hand in fury. The gods then took Fenrir to a remote place, tied him to a boulder, and placed a sword in his jaws to keep them open. His howls turned into a foamy river, and there he remained, bound until Ragnarok. So, of course, with all of these myths, we have to talk about where it all started, the Norse creation myth. In the beginning, there was only Ginnungagap, lying between the fiery Muspelheim and the icy Niflheim. As fire and ice meet in the abyss, they created Ymir, the first giant, who ended up being able to reproduce, spawning more giants from his sweat. Alongside Ymir emerged a cow whose milk nourished him. The cow licked the salty ice, gradually uncovering Buri, the ancestor of the Aesir gods. Buri's lineage led to Odin and his brothers. Odin and his brothers ended up killing Ymir, and they used his body to form the world. His blood became the oceans, his skin the soil, his hair the vegetation, and his skull the sky, and his brain the clouds. They also created the first humans from tree trunks and protected them by building a fence around their dwelling place, Midgard. This myth illustrates the Norse view of creation as an act of bringing order from chaos. Ymir represents the raw chaotic potential, while the god's act of crafting the world from his body symbolizes the creation of order and structure. The giants, born from Ymir, embody the forces of chaos that constantly threaten this order. The gods and giants are in a perpetual struggle, reflecting the Norse beliefs that the world is a battleground between order and chaos, a tension that will only only be resolved at Ragnarok, the end of the world. Next, we are talking about the curse of Andvari's ring. Andvari was a dwarf living behind a waterfall, and he had a hoard of gold and the ability to transform into a pike, making him a pretty formidable fisherman. Nearby lived Hreidmar and his sons Regin, Fafnir, and Otter, each with unique skills. Otter, who could transform into an otter, often fished in Andvari's pool. One day, while Otter was resting, Odin, Honir, and Loki came upon him. Mistaking him for a regular otter, Loki killed him and then they skinned him as a trophy. They presented the skin to Hreidmar. He was furious and demanded that they fill the skin with gold as compensation. Loki used a net borrowed from Ran, the sea goddess, to capture Andvari, and he took all of his gold, including the ring. Enraged, Andvari cursed the ring and all of the gold to bring doom to its holders. Hreidmar accepted the cursed treasure, but his son Fafnir, driven by greed, killed him and took the hoard, transforming into a dragon to guard it. Regin later manipulated Sigurd into killing Fafnir, but Sigurd killed Regin too. The cursed gold passed through many hands before eventually returning to Andvari's cave, though the ring was lost forever. Next, we are talking about the fortification of Asgard. So Asgard was the fortress of the Aesir gods, and it wasn't always protected by its iconic high wall. This is the story of how that wall came to be. One day, a smith, likely a giant, offered to build a massive wall around Asgard in just 3 seasons, but he demanded Freya's hand in marriage along with the sun and moon. Simple requests, I guess. The gods were hesitant, but Loki proposed that they agree, with the condition that the smith complete the wall in 1 winter using only his horse Svadilfari. Confident that the task was impossible, the gods agreed. To their surprise, the smith made rapid progress, with Svadilfari doing much of the heavy lifting. As the end of winter approached, the wall was nearly complete except for the stones around the gate. Panicking, the gods turned on Loki, threatening him with death if he didn't stop the smith. Loki promised to find a solution. That night, Loki transformed into a mare and lured the horse away. The stallion chased Loki all night, preventing the smith from finishing the wall. When morning came and the horse was still missing, the smith realized he couldn't complete his task. The gods then revealed the true nature of the deal, and Thor killed the smith with his hammer. Meanwhile, Loki in his mare form gave birth to an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir, who would become Odin's steed, who we actually mentioned at the beginning in the death of Baldur's story. Thus, through trickery and transformation, the wall of Asgard was completed without the gods having to sacrifice Freya, the sun, or the moon. And finally, to close out our list today, we are talking about the kidnapping of Idun. Idun was a key goddess in Norse mythology, and she guarded magical fruits that kept the gods young. During a journey, Odin, Loki, and Honir encountered an eagle who was actually a giant in disguise who magically prevented their food from cooking. The eagle demanded a portion of their meat to lift the spell. When Loki attacked the eagle in anger, it grabbed Loki and flew him into the sky, forcing him to promise to bring Idun and her fruits to the giant/eagle's lair. Back in Asgard, Loki tricked the goddess into following him into the forest, where the giant/eagle then kidnapped her. Without the goddess, the gods began to age rapidly. Suspecting Loki was to blame, they forced him to confess and threatened him with death if he didn't rescue her. With Freya's hawk feathers, Loki flew to the giant's home, turned the goddess into a nut, and then escaped with her. The giant eagle pursued them, but the gods set a trap, creating a fire barrier that killed him as he chased Loki into Asgard. Thus, Idun was saved, and the gods regained their youth.
For no reason. As an example, what's up with Lita? We know that Zeus transforms whatever he wants to get whatever he wants because he can, and because being the god of all gods, he is known for being a little bit of a rascal. By that I mean he sleeps with everyone, and well, actually anyone. Gods, demigods, animals, mortals, and sometimes with mortals as animals. As in the story, Zeus sees Lita and fell absolutely in love with her. So he's like, you know what? I will transform into a swan just to be with her. And he did. He turns into a swan, and the night Lita lays with her husband, afterwards she lays with a swan, because she was into that. Somehow she sleeps with a swan, and yes, comes out 2 eggs, or well, 2 sets of twins, as the first set was Helen and Clytemnestra, and the other set was Castor and Pollux. All myths seems to agree that Pollux was an immortal and Helen was Zeus's daughter. Is there any point to this conception? Well, aside the legends of Pollux and Helen, is we known as Helen of Troy, but I don't know. What's more interesting is the fact that he had to be a swan to do it, or she laid eggs. Or maybe she did it. Or maybe he laid the eggs. I don't know. What would you do if you were Lita? Are you into that? Well, if you got more than one sibling, sometimes your mom would call you by the wrong name and call you by your sibling's name instead. At least what I assume what happened to those two. If that didn't happen, well, maybe it's just you. If not, not everyone can live the same life experiences, especially the son of Leprosy of Thrace, who attacked everyone's favorite party house god, Dionysus, while he was traveling, trying to teach everyone how to make wine. I mean, what a party pooper. The gods punished Leprosy with madness, and in the heat of this madness of his rampage, he saw his son and thought his son was a plant. So he thought, oh my god, this vine needs to be clipped. So he wielded an axe and killed his own son as well as the rest of his family, because if you saw your plant-like son, wouldn't you also cut him up? After there are so many myths that would say that he used the same axe to cut off his own legs, and in some way, I guess this story was warning mortals to not mess with the party god. What do you think? I mean, in Greek mythology, we will see a lot of conception, as it's pretty normal, of knowing who your daddy is. Ixion wanted to be the father of so many, and so the story goes that Ixion was in exile for punishing his supposed father-in-law for stealing his horses. He punished his father-in-law by burning coals and violating the Gus house rules, as well as kinslaying. So by his action, he was banished, and when Zeus took pity on him, he invited him to come to Olympus as a guest. Of course, this was probably not a smart move on Zeus' part. After all, there was once there, Ixion saw Hera and was completely obsessed with her. So Zeus, testing his loyalty, created a cloud version of his wife, Hera, which somehow Ixion impregnated, and Zeus was very pissed off. He became so angry and punished Ixion by informing Hermes to bind him into every spinning gigantic flaming wheel for all eternity, and the impregnated cloud gave birth to half horses and half man known as centaurs. But keep in mind, it wasn't just the gods who were cruel at random, but of course humans are just as susceptible. Once there was a man named Chiron who loved to rob people. Just loved it. His method would be to call travelers on the road and ask them to help wash his feet, and they would offer to help, and he would then kick them off face first off the cliff, and if it wasn't any worse, a giant turtle will come at the bottom of the cliff and eat the remains of the still living. If the fall didn't kill them, then this did. He did this over and over and over again, killing so many people because he felt like it, and the hero Theseus was so tired of his shenanigans that he confronted Chiron, and by karma, he threw him off the cliff, which many would say is a fitting end. And speaking of karma, although she may not have much good karma, Arachne was a wonderful and very talented seamstress, and she would sometimes boast that she was better than other people, and importantly better than the goddess Athena. Eventually this got to Athena's ear and cautioned her to be quiet of this false rumor, and when she didn't listen, Athena then challenged her and gave her a once-in-a-chance lifetime to prove herself in a weaving contest, which is at a great cause as she shows that she wants to give her a chance. But when Athena saw how beautiful the tapestry Arachne made, she was actually upset and exploded in a fit of rage and jealousy and cursed at the girl to feel guilty for what she had done. Arachne felt so much guilt that she took her own life, but Athena wasn't done with her yet, as she took Arachne's body and transformed her into a spider so she would weave for all eternity, which we know now in the scientific terms for spiders are arachni. I don't know about you, but I'm kind of afraid of spiders, but what do you think? What would you be transformed as if Athena punished you? Write it down in the comments. At least once in a while, we see gods not behaving badly as much as we are told in the stories they do. Apollo grew up into adulthood within 4 days on a small island and wasn't able to leave. When he then decided to leave out of all sea creatures, he transformed himself into a dolphin, which is actually very popular in Roman history. This somehow turned the sea into a raging storm because apparently turning into a dolphin makes the sea mad, and he spotted a ship in distress and decided to save it. He leapt on the deck and still in dolphin form and guided the ship to a safe place on the shore. From there he set off to what gods do and honor himself in this method of escape, and so Apollo then named a city Delphi after his dolphin form. The labors of Hercules, also known as the 12 labors, are among the most famous stories in Greek mythology. Hercules was given a series of tasks that seem impossible to complete. However, through a combination of strength, wit, and assistance from the gods, Hercules was able to overcome these challenges and achieve redemption. The task ranged from slaying fearsome beasts like the Nemean lion and the nine-headed Hydra, to capturing mythical creatures like the golden hen of Artemis and the Erythmian boar. Each of these tasks were fraught with danger and required not only immensely physical strength, but also cleverness and bravery. In each of these cases, though, Hercules was able to overcome his odds and complete his task, proving this heroism and earning his redemption. But I don't know, was it actually real? Prometheus was a unique figure among the Titans, and he was known for his wisdom and foresight, and he had a particular fondness for humanity. Very good guy, which set him apart from most of the other gods and Titans. This fondness led him to commit one of the most audacious acts, though, in all of mythology. He stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. Fire in this context was more than just a practical tool, it actually represented knowledge, progress, and civilization. By giving fire to humans, Prometheus not only provided them with the means of survival, but also set them on a path towards progress and enlightenment. But this angered Zeus, as he was enraged by Prometheus' audacity and the potential threat that the enlightenment of humanity could pose to the gods. He just wanted humans to be very dumb. Prometheus was then chained to a rock and the Caucasus Mountains, and every day an eagle would swoop down and eat his liver. Every night his liver would regenerate, only to be eaten again the next day. This cycle of torment was for Prometheus' fate for eternity. No idea why it had to be an eagle eating his liver, but it is what it is. This guy, though, was really into mannequins, or in this case, statues. Pygmalion was a talented sculptor from an island of Cyprus and saw all the women around him, and he felt he wanted to make the perfect woman. So he made an ivory-like woman with such skill that she almost seemed alive. He named her Galate, and just like that, he fell in love with this statue. He gave her everything, jewels, diamonds, silks to wear, but of course she was just a statue, and she just could not give love back to Pygmalion. So during the festival of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, he begged and prayed to have his wife like his statue. Moved by his love and desire, she actually granted his wish, and Aphrodite did like a blue fairy from Pinocchio. She turned the statue into a real woman. Galate then married Pygmalion, and they lived happily ever after. I guess in that story, it was actually a pretty nice one. But some may or may not know this story, as this may not be a nice one, as Oedipus was the son of Laius, the king of Thebes, and his wife Jocasta. Before his death, an oracle prophesied that Oedipus would be killing his father and marry his mother. Absolutely horrified by this prophecy, Laius and Jocasta decided to kill their newborn, and they ordered a servant to leave the newborn to die on the mountainside. However, the servant then took pity of the infant and gave him to a shepherd to the neighboring city of Corinth. The shepherd, in turn, gave the baby to a childless king and the queen of Corinth, who raised him as their own. Unaware of who his real parents were, Oedipus visited an oracle and heard the same prophecy his birth parents heard. Believing it was his adopted parents was his biological parents, he left to avoid the prophecy. But unfortunately, when he left, he encountered his real dad and killed them. This is like Maury Povich level. It's really funny. Unwillingly fulfilling the first half of the prophecy, he then arrived to Thebes, where he was able to defeat a sphinx, and his reward was becoming king and married the widow of that kingdom, in other words, his mom. Not your mom, but his. Anyways, that's all for today. It's pretty wild how the Greeks got some tales to tell, but like all myths, they all stem from some kind of truth, so maybe that Oedipus one was real.
How about we start off with the first thing that popped into my mind, animal court. Yep, Fido and Mittens could be dragged in front of a criminal court back in the day if they didn't follow animal law. There are records of at least 85 animal trials that took place during medieval times, and the tales vary from the tragic to the absurd. By far the most serial offenders were pigs, accused and convicted of chewing off body parts and even eating tiny humans. Most were found guilty and sentenced to the rope necklace or even being burned at the stake like traditional witches. In 1386, a convicted pig was dressed in a waistcoat, gloves, drawers, and a human mask for its execution. Granted, it wasn't just pigs that felt the hand of the law, though. In 1474, a court found a rooster guilty of the unnatural crime of laying an egg. Unwanted rats often found themselves on the receiving end of a strongly worded letter asking them to get the heck out. And curiously enough, there was a trial of dolphins in Marseille in 1596. Granted, not all the trials ended in brutality. One donkey, which found herself the victim of unwanted advances, was proclaimed innocent after a strong recommendation from a commons prior, declaring her to be a virtuous and well-behaved animal. Hey look, if anybody wants to hold court for modern dogs that chew up furniture, be my guest. I don't think much surprises me anymore. Well, let's see. Has anybody heard about the dead Pope trial? Alright, picture the late 800s, a tumultuous time for popes as Charlemagne's once mighty empire crumbled into scattered different areas, each eyeing Rome's treasury. The papacy, weakened, sought alliances with secular leaders to maintain influence. Enter Bishop Formosus of Portus, a rising figure in Catholic circles managing church matters across Europe. Despite commendable work, this bishop found himself on the wrong side of political disputes. Accused of crimes under church law, he was convicted, defrocked, and excommunicated by Pope John VIII. But, in the intricate dance of medieval politics, his excommunication was lifted 6 years later. Released from his oath, he returned to his diocese and in a twist of fate, became Pope in 891. When he died in 896, his legacy remained tangled in political webs. Enter Pope Stephen VI, pressured by folks who harbored a grudge against the previous pope. The infamous Cadaver Synod unfolded, a grotesque spectacle where the previous pope's rotting corpse was put on trial. Now Pope Stephen appointed himself prosecutor, hurling insults at the lifeless Pope's remains, accusing the former Pope of posthumous crimes. The charges ranged from performing bishop duties after promising not to, assuming the papacy, to conspiring against a previous pope. In a macabre climax, the 3 fingers used for blessings were hacked off, the papal crown removed, and the body tossed into the Tiber River. The aftermath saw monks retrieving the corpse, rumors of miraculous events, and local bishops staging a Vatican coup. Decrees of the Cadaver Synod were annulled, reinstated, and the bones were shuffled between resting places. So hopefully the poor guy is finally resting in peace, because that's just wild. Y'all have heard about trial by combat, right? Even though it was technically first practiced by Germanic peoples, it was sometimes used to settle disputes in medieval Europe. Not everybody was allowed to fight, but there are records of monasteries fighting other monasteries and wives fighting their husbands. Generally the loser would be executed, but this didn't always happen. In 979, the royal court in the Holy Roman Empire set up a trial by combat between Count Gero of Elseben and a Saxon named Waldo. The historical record isn't super duper clear about why the men fought, but Waldo brought some kind of charge against Gero, and Gero was arrested. Look, back in the day you didn't need a million pages of evidence and Harvey Specter to win a case, okay? So in the battle, Gero cut Waldo's neck, but Waldo disabled Gero with a blow to the head, winning the fight. Right after beating Gero, however, Waldo collapsed dead. So you'd think dying would have ruined Waldo's victory, but the judges still insisted that the dead man won. Since Gero was a technical loser, Emperor Otto II ordered for the count to be decapitated, so nobody really won this one. If you thought we were gonna make it through today without a single witchcraft case, you'd be mistaken. Stedlin of Voltingen was a Swiss farmer who lived in the municipality of Voltingen sometime between 1392 and 1406. So one year when his crop yield was better than his neighbors, rumors spread that he was a sorcerer. It was said that he only had such a good yield because he used magic to transport crops from other people's fields. He could also supposedly control the weather and caused a local woman to miscarry 7 times in a row. Eventually, Stedlin was arrested and confessed to being a sorcerer after being tormented. He claimed that he was in contact with demons, and those demons would summon thunderstorms after he tossed a black chicken up into the air. As for his neighbor's trouble with bearing offspring, he said her infertility was the result of a lizard he buried on her property. He also revealed that his wife was a witch and recommended that the authorities not believe her if she said otherwise. For his confession, this man was burned at the stake, while his wife got the same punishment for not confessing. So, damned if you do, damned if you don't, damned all around. I think we're gonna hit on all of the old expressions today, so we might as well get trial by fire out of the way now. In late 15th century Florence, the Dominican preacher and reformer Girolamo Savonarola was one of the most powerful men in the city. He attacked the government and the Catholic Church, and also claimed to be a prophet in touch with God. In 1494, Florence became a democratic republic, and Savonarola became its new leader. Didn't last long though. 3 years later, Savonarola was excommunicated by the Pope for his rebellious behavior and preaching. So the next year, a rival named Francesco da Puglia challenged Savonarola to a trial by fire to prove that the Pope was correct to banish him. The logic of the trial was this: if Savonarola could walk through fire without being burned, then it would show that God was on his side and the Pope was wrong. So the trial was held on April 7th. A crowd gathered to watch the spectacle, because, why not? What else are you gonna do? But Savonarola and his supporters ended up arguing with the other side until a thunderstorm broke out and put out the fire. So after that fiasco, Savonarola was arrested, confessed to being a false prophet, and was sentenced to the rope necklace with 2 of his supporters. Next up, we have a case of somebody just trying to make a damn living. John Rykener was a 14th century Londoner who lived quite the double life. Not Hannah Montana style, but just wait. He was a playboy who had very fun encounters with countless women, for pleasure, but he also dressed up as a woman and worked as a lady of the night under the name Eleanor. Sadly, one day John was picked up by city officials after being caught with a client in a stall in the street. The client told authorities that he paid for intercourse with John, but had no idea that John was, biologically male. John, dressed as Eleanor, admitted the truth of the situation and then turned over a pretty embarrassing list of other men he'd slept with for money. 3 of John's clients were aristocratic scholars, and many of the others were chaplains, friars, and priests, which that goes against their vows. John seemed to have a thing for holy people, because he also slept with nuns for free while dressed as a man, because you gotta be charitable about it. Sadly, there aren't any records about what happened to him after his arrest, but if he wasn't let go for his embarrassing testimony, he was probably convicted of sodomy. You know the old saying, those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it? Yeah, we're gonna revisit that in just a second. So in medieval times, leprosy was thought to be highly contagious. Medieval Europeans were very paranoid about catching the disease, so lepers were shunned and segregated from mainstream society. I'm seeing similarities to the AIDS epidemic. and the stigma that has followed the condition to this day. So lepers were not only considered unclean, but also suspicious and untrustworthy. In spring of 1321, a story began to spread in southern France that lepers were plotting to poison wells and infect the entire country with leprosy, so they could overthrow the government and take control of France. Now, of course, the entire story was fake, but King Philip V ordered that all the country's lepers be arrested and put on trial for treason. Hysterical mobs killed lepers with impunity, while those who actually got trials were tormented and burned at the stake. By the end of the year, when the frenzy had largely subsided, thousands of lepers had died in massacres and trials. Nobody in power bothered to apologize until 1338, when the Pope, then centered in the French city of Avignon, acknowledged that the lepers were innocent. About damn time. Next up in our type of trials is none other than trials by ordeal, which were rites designed to invoke divine intervention for a just outcome. The belief was that if a defendant were truly innocent, God would step in and work a miracle to avert a miscarriage of justice. Far from a theatrical charade, people of the medieval world really believed in God's vigilant oversight, incapable of allowing an innocent to be wrongly accused. Now, these trials were not for the faint-hearted. Defendants faced challenges like walking over hot irons or retrieving stones from boiling water, their innocence hinging on the timely healing of inflicted injuries. In a more bizarre version involving cold water, bound suspects were tossed in to sink or float, as water, believed to be pure, had the power to repel sin. One intriguing but historically questionable tale involves Emma of Normandy, accused of adultery with Bishop Elfwine of Winchester. Convinced of her innocence, Emma volunteered for the ordeal of hot iron. The Archbishop of Canterbury agreed, but only with rigorous conditions. To quote him, "Let the ill-famed woman walk 9 paces, with bare feet on 9 red-hot plowshares, 4 to clear herself and 5 to clear the bishop. If she falters, if she does not press one of the plowshares fully with her feet, if she has harmed the one least bit, then let her be judged a fornicator." So Emma, led by bishops, walked the red-hot path in a church, invoking divine intervention. According to chroniclers, she navigated this entire thing unscathed, seemingly oblivious to the searing heat. So afterwards, her feet were examined, or so the report goes, and they were found to be uninjured. So, hello, a miracle. Emma was found innocent of the charge and free to go, with all her confiscated property restored. Hey, I love a good miracle story, don't you? So remember earlier when I mentioned how animals used to be put on trial? They weren't alone in that. Any kind of critter could be sent to court. Like, even insects weren't immune to prosecution. Not that I particularly want them to be. Throughout this time period in Europe, there were many cases of court-sanctioned bug-bashing, with church authorities acting as a sort of holy pest control company. Pope Stephen VI even once sprayed a pesticide of holy water around Rome's rural outskirts. I wonder, like, holy exterminators? Could that be a thing? Pulpit pronouncements were often used in conjunction with trials, and on occasion the insects would even be told in writing, or verbally, that they would like it much better in a neighboring village. In 1478 in Switzerland, seed beetles were prosecuted for wreaking havoc on crops. After much public reprimanding of the insects and head-scratching from local dignitaries, the Bishop of Lausanne issued a cease and desist order to the bugs. Now, the insects ignored this, so then the bishop ordered them to leave the land within 6 days, proclaiming that these creatures were not passengers on Noah's Ark and were so open, and ergo were open to excommunication. If they refused to leave, they were ordered to appear in Avanches to explain their refusal to budge. The records don't mention whether they turned up in Avanches, but the next year they were back, and the church blamed the pest's continuing presence on the sins of the people. Sins which they could offset by coughing up more tithe money, incidentally. Wow, I'm so shocked. More money for the church so we could get rid of things? And since I'm in a funny mood, let's end today with another buggy case, if you will. In Mainz, Germany, local people brought a prosecution against some Spanish flies. Now, if you're unaware of them, they're also known as a blister beetle and are dangerous to livestock and ruinous to vegetation. Hence, the furious Rhineland farmers were happy to see the church court weigh in on these mischievous mini-beasts. In view of their small size, the judge appointed for them a learned defender who represented his clients with great dignity. Well, to the shock and surprise of nobody, the court banished them, kindly approving an allocated plot of land for the creepy crawlies to retire to. Now, we're not sure if the puny prisoners made it to their reservation, but any failure on this case was likely pinned on the townsfolk's lack of religion. Go figure.
3 missing Marines. When the United States fled Vietnam on April 30th, 1975, it had signified the official end of the Vietnam War. But yet, less than 2 weeks later, on May 12th, 1975, the Khmer Rouge, or Cambodia's communist regime, commandeered an American cargo ship, dragging the USA right back in. And so the US began a rescue mission to get their ship back. But the entire operation has been shrouded in mystery and uncertainty, including 3 Marines who've straight up disappeared. In order to get this ship back, 100 Marine reinforcements were sent to the Cambodian island of Koh Tang. But here's the weird thing. The ship and its crew had already been recovered. Yet in preparation, the reinforcements were informed they would face up to 40 old men and farmers. Instead, when they arrived, around 200 battle-ready people awaited them. And to make matters worse, using information from interviews and declassified documents, it was revealed that defense officials knew in advance about the fighters, but nobody told the Marines. Now comes the disappearances. Gary Hall, Joseph Hargrove, and Danny Marshall, all Marines, were unaccounted for, and the US military maintains that they disobeyed orders by not making it to the helicopters in time and had likely lost their lives. While Khmer Rouge commanders have said they captured and ended the lives of these three, expeditions into the area have found nothing about them. And now, to this day, no one knows what happened to Gary Hall, Joseph Hargrove, and Danny Marshall. At number 9, we have Agent Orange. 2 years before these three disappeared in Cambodia, the last GI to lose their life directly in combat in Vietnam perished in 1973. 11 hours after, the Paris Peace Accords were signed and a ceasefire commenced. But even though the combat directly didn't end lives anymore, it had done a huge toll on Cambodia's soil and would create humongous challenges for those living there. An article from 2017 by The Conversation revealed that between 1961 and 1971, the US showered Vietnam with around 73 million liters of chemical agents, which they said would be to strip away the vegetation that gave Viet Cong soldiers cover. And while it might have been effective, 45 million liters of these chemicals were Agent Orange, which has impacted people in Vietnam to this day. Not only were 50% of Vietnam's mangrove forests decimated, the US Department of Veterans Affairs lists 14 different diseases, including Parkinson's and 7 kinds of cancer, linked to Agent Orange exposure. But it gets worse. A 2003 article by The Guardian revealed that the Agent Orange used was 25% more potent than the country's own guidelines suggested it would be. The United States has attempted to aid those who suffered illnesses from the pesticide, as in 1979 a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of 2.4 million veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange during their service in Vietnam. 5 years later, in an out-of-court settlement, 7 large chemical companies that manufactured the herbicide agreed to pay $180 million in compensation to the veterans or their next of kin. And unfortunately, no such plan has been created in Vietnam. At number 8, we have the Tiger Force. There are plenty of troops from Vietnam who've had their names remembered for their actions, but almost none are as memorable as the Tiger Force. They were a specialized unit of the US Army's 101st Airborne Division. It was officially known as the Reconnaissance Platoon of the 1st Battalion, 327th Infantry Regiment, 1st Brigade, 101st Airborne Division. The unit operated mainly from 1967 to 1971, and while the unit was tasked with gathering information and disrupting enemy transmissions, the group turned loss of life into their way of life, getting to the point where almost every member had a necklace of ears. And yes, that's exactly what it sounds like. It took until years after the war had ended for the majority of crimes this unit committed to come to the forefront, and former members have gone on the record talking about how they lost track of just how many people were slain by their hands. At times it didn't matter if they were enemy or innocent. In 2003, the Toledo Blade released a story saying the helpless victims of the unit were in the hundreds, but the 18 people found as culprits, none of them have faced any consequences. At number 7, we have the Mei Massacre. But this wasn't the only case of mass innocents losing their lives. Charlie Company, a unit of the American military's 23rd Infantry Division, was tasked with carrying out a search and destroy mission in the Mei hamlet of South Vietnam. Soldiers were sent to the area to root out Viet Cong insurgents and their supporters. However, the mission turned into a horrific massacre. Instead of engaging enemy combatants, the soldiers, under the command of Lieutenant William Cowie, began indiscriminately targeting unarmed civilians, rounding up villagers, herding them into ditches, and executing them. The exact number of casualties is still a matter of debate, but estimates suggest that it's between 347 to 504 who lost their lives. Initially, the incident was covered up, but eventually accounts of the massacre began to surface. Investigations and reports by journalists, particularly the work of investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, led to widespread public outrage and condemnation. In the aftermath, several soldiers were charged and faced court-martial for their roles. William Cowie in particular was court-martialed, found guilty of murder, and initially sentenced to life in prison. However, his sentence was later reduced as he served only a few years under house arrest. Number 6, we have tiger cages. For the South Vietnamese forces, they needed something to deal with the mass number of prisoners they had detained from Viet Cong forces, amongst other things. What they decided upon were what's been dubbed the tiger cages, some of the smallest cells humans have been kept in. First shared to the masses over 50 years ago by Life magazine, these cages were identified as being in Con Giao prison and were 5 feet by 9 feet. And while not everyone was housed inside these, overall conditions of Con Giao prison were horrific. And what made this worse was the fact that the US helped fund this, and advisors wouldn't stop the torment that was unfolding. For years they funded these inhumane prisons, and when the war ended, US police and prison advisors to Vietnam were sent packing. By the end of 1973, due to mass protests about the tiger cages amongst other things, Congress voted to shut down the Office of Public Safety, which operated all the US assistance programs to police and prisons of other countries. At number 5 we have the Amerasians. Fleeing Vietnam not only had an impact on the soldiers, it also left tons of Amerasians without a father. Well, who are Amerasians? The Amerasians, who were born to Vietnamese mothers and American fathers, faced significant challenges due to the circumstances of their birth and aftermath of the war. Amerasians often faced discrimination and societal stigma in Vietnam. They were sometimes seen as symbols of the war and its aftermath, and they encountered difficulties in being fully accepted by either American or Vietnamese society. Many faced poverty, lack of access to education, healthcare, and other basic needs. In fact, they were called children of the dust, earning that title because they viewed them as insignificant as a speck to be brushed aside. No one knows how many Amerasians were born and ultimately left behind in Vietnam, but as per recent records, it seems the majority are now residing in the United States. The US assisted in bringing them over 10 years after the war ended by enacting the Amerasian Homecoming Act of 1987. This helped Amerasians and their families by allowing them to immigrate to the United States and providing them with support, including access to education, healthcare, and citizenship rights. But that didn't stop the years of trauma in the fact that the majority were left without family or an ability to speak the language in their new home country. Now, organizations like Amerasians Without Borders aim to bring the remaining ones home to the United States and set them up with their families. But the work isn't done yet. At number 4 we have the Tet Offensive. There were multiple events that lowered Americans' faith in the United States' involvement in Vietnam, and one of those was how they handled the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive was a significant military campaign launched by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army beginning on January 30th, 1968. It has its name because it occurred during the Vietnamese New Year holiday known as Tet, which is a traditional period of ceasefire and celebration in Vietnam. The offensive was a coordinated series of surprise attacks across South Vietnam, targeting cities, towns, and military installations. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army launched simultaneous assaults on more than 100 towns and cities, including the capital of Saigon, which is now Ho Chi Minh City, and the ancient city of Hue. What separated it was that the attacks during the Tet Offensive were a departure from the usual hit-and-run guerrilla tactics employed by the Viet Cong. This offensive aimed to strike multiple targets simultaneously, causing confusion, weakening South Vietnamese and American forces, and sparking a general uprising amongst the South Vietnamese population. The offensive initially took the forces by surprise, and the scale and scope of the attack challenged the belief held by many Americans that the Vietnam War was being won. While the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces achieved some tactical success and captured several key locations temporarily, this offensive ultimately did not result in a military victory for the communist forces, but it led to tons more protests and Lyndon B. Johnson not seeking re-election, which resulted in Richard Nixon taking power. At number 3, we have Nixon nixing a trial. When Nixon took power in 1969, he publicly pledged to diminish America's involvement in the Vietnam War, and then he orchestrated devastating bombings in Cambodia while aiming to keep this operation concealed, even if it necessitated curtailing a murder trial before it commenced. During that year, the Green Berets, engaged in a covert mission to evaluate the efficiency of the Cambodia bombings, encountered an unsettling revelation. Thai Kak Kwan, suspected of being a communist spy, was a disconcerting figure amongst their ranks. Despite enduring 3 days of intensive interrogation that failed to elicit a confession, Chian was executed by 3 berets, purportedly for betrayal. This act concluded with his body being disposed of in a murky body of water concealed from view. The exposure of this was instigated by his wife, who, aided by general harboring disdain for the Green Berets, brought the truth to light. Although 8 men faced charges for the crime, Nixon, seeking to bury the incident, exerted pressure to have the case dismissed. Ultimately, a congressman intervened in Nixon's favor, leveraging the threat of halting defense funding unless the army halted proceedings on the grounds of national security. And then, court proceedings were terminated under the guise of safeguarding national interests. However, the unraveling of this cover-up was set in motion by military analyst Daniel Ellsberg. Ellsberg eventually leaked the Pentagon Papers, revealing the egregious deception perpetrated by the government throughout the Vietnam War, which included the suppressed truth behind Nixon's actions. At number 2, we have the Battle of Hamburger Hill. 5 months into Nixon's presidency, and the US was still involved, with one major event being the Battle of Hamburger Hill. Also known as the Battle of Hill 937, it was a significant and fiercely contested battle that took place from May 10th to May 20th, 1969, in the A Shau Valley of South Vietnam. The battle was part of Operation Apache Snow, a mission conducted by US forces with the objective of seizing Hill 937, a strategically insignificant but heavily fortified hill held by the North Vietnamese Army. The hill was dubbed Hamburger Hill due to the intense fighting and high casualty rates experienced by the American forces. The assault was launched by the 101st Airborne Division, and it quickly escalated into a brutal brutal and grueling battle characterized by heavy artillery barrages, close quarters combat, and determined resistance from the entrenched North Vietnamese forces. The North Vietnamese army had constructed extensive bunkers and fortifications on the hill, making it a challenging target to capture. Despite facing heavy losses and mounting criticism over the strategic insignificance of the hill, forces persisted in their efforts. So, after multiple assaults and intense fighting, the Americans eventually succeeded in securing Hill 937. However, the victory came at a high cost. Approximately 70 US soldiers lost their lives and hundreds were wounded during the battle. And to make things worse, Hill was ultimately abandoned a few weeks later, which definitely didn't help the anti-war sentiment. Finally, we have the Battle of E Drang. To end things off, we'll bring it to where it really started, the Battle of E Drang. The battle marked the first major clash between the United States Army and the North Vietnamese Army and was part of Operation Silver Bayonet. This incident involved elements of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment led by Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore against the North Vietnamese's 66th Regiment. The E Drang Valley was chosen as a landing zone for US troops to engage and disrupt North Vietnamese operations in the area. The American forces were deployed by helicopter into landing zone X-Ray, initiating the battle. The battle was characterized by intense and fierce combat, with both sides sustaining heavy casualties. The North Vietnamese employed guerrilla tactics and utilized the dense jungle terrain to their advantage. The American soldiers faced a determined enemy, and the battle was marked by close quarters fighting and heavy casualties. Despite being outnumbered, US forces demonstrated their firepower and skills. The battle was brutal and chaotic, with soldiers facing tremendous challenges due to the unpredictable nature of combat in dense jungle terrain. The battle concluded after several days of fighting, with both sides claiming victory. The US forces managed to hold their ground and successfully repel the North Vietnamese attacks. The battle resulted in significant casualties, and still, no one would have any clue of what was to come in the years going forward.
During the mass extinction event of the 1930s and 40s, scientists in New Zealand devised a secret plan to create a tsunami device capable of flooding coastal cities and incapacitating enemies. The project started after US Navy officer E.A. Gibson noticed small waves generated by explosions used to clear coral reefs, and the idea was developed by the United States and New Zealand military in a program code named Project SEAL. Now, the weapons concept was deemed feasible, but the weapons themselves were never fully developed or used. A related concept, the bouncing device, was developed and used in the Yahtzee years to be dropped into water as a means to destroy dams and cause loss of industrial capacity and widespread flooding. So sure, while the thing technically never got made, the research from this project actually led to the devastating explosives we know today. Human experimentation by Japanese Unit 731 during that same time period, committed primarily against innocent civilians, was a thing. Now, there's not enough time today to list the half of it, but here's an idea. Dissection of living humans, pregnant folks, usually without anesthesia, and usually after they had been deliberately exposed and left to suffer from horrible diseases, chemical and biological weapons, and so forth and so on. Horror movie level surgeries involving cutting off limbs and reattaching them to the wrong sides of a victim, removing organs and connecting the tubes back together without them to see what would happen. Like, this was inhumane. We can't forget that these victims were routinely tormented just for the fun of it, even without flimsy excuses like science. This makes other folks look like misunderstood humanitarians. The victim count was in the thousands upon thousands. These were innocent people, or they were prisoners. They were folks that didn't deserve it. The icing on the cake, General MacArthur and the rest of the US government found out about it when they captured Japan, and they granted Unit 731 immunity for their crimes so long as they shared their findings with America and only America. Many of the unit members went on to have very successful and profitable futures after this. There was nothing 1950s and 60s America loved more than dropping big nuclear devices and watching them go kaboom. But in these early days of nuclear weaponry, we still didn't really know the effects that these tests had on the human body. So Project Sunshine was a series of research studies that began in 1953 to figure out the impact of radioactive fallout on the world's population. This thing sought to examine the long-term effects of nuclear radiation on the biosphere due to repeated nuclear detonations of increasing yields. Particularly, they were like, hey, let's check out the tissue from young people, because their developing bones have the highest propensity to accumulate all of this, and therefore the highest susceptibility to damage. So it was in this environment that scientists at the Sunshine Conference, ergo the name, they argued in favor of sampling human samples, for lack of a better word. In 1955, there was a meeting of the Atomic Energy Commission, which came up with some of the specifics of the testing and urged researchers to use their own contacts to discreetly get a hold of tissue and bone samples, also not getting permission of the deceased. Literally, there's a direct quote saying, "Human samples are of prime importance, and if anybody knows how to do a good job of body snatching, they will really be serving their country." Well, about 6,000 corpses from 26 bone collection sites around the world were shipped under top secret conditions to the project's headquarters in Chicago and to other research facilities. In the 13th century, Gangas Khan killed so many peasants that the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere were significantly reduced as a result. So during his 20-year reign, Genghis Khan's destructive armies were responsible for the deaths of like 40 million people. While his intentions for the mass killings were anything but pure, with nobody left to farm the lands owned by the peasants, they were eventually allowed to grow back into carbon-absorbing forests. It's estimated that 700 million tons of carbon were wiped from the atmosphere, which is about the same amount of carbon dioxide generated in a year through global petrol consumption. Back in 897 AD, the Catholic Church put a dead man on trial, known as the Cadaver Synod. The posthumous trial of Pope Formosus was held by Pope Stephen VI, his successor. So Pope Formosus was accused of doing bad things with the papacy, even though he was like dead for 7 months by the point he was accused. So the body of the Pope was exhumed, dressed in papal attire, and brought to the court for judgment. And they even appointed a deacon to speak on behalf of the dead Pope. But he was found guilty, all his acts as Pope were declared null and void, his body was stripped of the garments and dressed in rags, his 3 fingers of benediction were cut off, and his body cast into the river Tiber, where ancient Romans disposed of their infamous criminals for centuries. But once again, like, he was dead, so it's kind of all just for show and theater. So I grew up visiting the Museum of Northern History, home of Sir Harry Oakes, and he's got quite the mysterious tale. Sir Harry earned his fortune in Canada and moved to the Bahamas in 1930s for tax purposes. Going back to when he moved to Canada, he arrived in Kirkland Lake, which is a tiny little town in northeastern Ontario, on June 19th of 1911, and in September of that same year, he registered the transfer of claim T-1663 and established the Lakeshore Mine. 20 years later, the gold mine was the most productive in the Western Hemisphere. Well, on the evening of July 8th, 1943, while living in the Bahamas, shortly after midnight, Harry had his life brutally ended. He was struck 4 times behind the left ear with a miner's handpick to disguise the wounds from a silver ice pick, and then was burned all over his body using insecticide, with the flames being concentrated around the eyes. His body was then sprinkled with feathers from a mattress. When he was discovered, the feathers were still being gently blown over his body by the bedroom fan. So the Bahamas governor, the Duke of Windsor, who had become a close friend of Harry's during the previous 3 years, took charge of the investigation from the get-go, inviting 2 American policemen he knew from Miami to take over the case instead of locals. Well, the 2 American policemen had conveniently forgotten their fingerprint kits, but hey, the local police force had those kits available, so cool. By the evening of day 2 of the investigation, 36 hours after the body was discovered, they had arrested the son-in-law, Count Alfred de Marigny. Count Alfred was on really bad terms with Sir Harry. Why? Well, he was a bit of a playboy, he didn't really have a meaningful career. Also, before he married Nancy, Harry's daughter, he had been married twice for short periods to wealthy women. So Alfred was acquitted in a trial that lasted several weeks. Why? Well, the detectives were suspected of fabricating evidence against him. The chief piece of evidence was a fingerprint. One of the officers was like, "Oh yeah, we found this in Oakes' bedroom where the body was." Nope, that's a big freaking lie. Later it was discovered that the print had been lifted from the water glass that Alfred had used during his questioning by the police captains. So, the mystery here? Who killed Sir Harry Oakes? Well, the theories that have emerged since 1943 have ranged from a killer reappearing from Oakes' Canadian past, rage-filled secret lover, and my favorite theory, and the one that I believe the most, hitman sent by mobster Meyer Lansky. Make of that what you will, folks. In the 18th century, a woman actually convinced doctors that she was giving birth to rabbits. Reportedly, Mary Toff gave birth to 9 of the fluffy creatures at a time. Doctors were convinced that she was telling the truth until they found pieces of corn inside the stomach of one of the rabbits, proving that like it hadn't developed inside her womb. Turns out she was manually inserting the rabbits to make the delivery look as realistic as possible. Ew! In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the Western world was desperate to see the primitive people described by explorers and adventurers that were scouting out new lands for colonial exploitation. To feed the frenzy, thousands of indigenous individuals from Africa, Asia, and the Americas were brought to the United States and Europe, more often than not under dubious circumstances, to be put on display in quasi-captive human zoos. One photo that really stood out to me was of the Filipino zoo girl who was on display at the Coney Island Zoo in 1914. This exhibit, known as The World in Miniature, was located located in Luna Park, and this poor girl was bound by ropes as people tossed peanuts at her. Most folks have no idea that these zoos existed, but they are definitely a dark part of history. And what's crazier still is that there are still some that have popped up in the 21st century, although not as cruel as they used to be. Ever hear of the Great Molasses Flood? In 1919, a peculiar disaster struck the streets of Boston. A massive wave of molasses. A large storage tank filled with 2.3 million US gallons of molasses burst. And the results? Well, we had a whole wave of molasses rushing through the street at about 35 miles per hour, killing 21 people and injuring about 150. The event entered local folklore, and residents reported for decades afterwards that the area still smelled of molasses on hot summer days. Also, if you've ever seen molasses move, if it's moving that fast, get out of there. 43 people lost their lives in the deadliest accident to ever take place on the London Underground in 1975. On the morning of February 28th, a train carrying about 300 passengers approached Moorgate Station, but it didn't slow down. It was traveling around 30 to 40 miles per hour, and one Leslie Newsom was at the controls. At about 8:46 a.m., the 6-car train slammed into the overrun tunnel, which was a dead end. An investigation later revealed that the brakes had not been applied, and Newsom, in the front of the train, made no move to stop the collision. So the first two cars and most of the third were crushed upon impact. The station went so dark, according to survivor Javier Gonzalez. When emergency personnel arrived, they reportedly found a carriage half the platform and half into the tunnel, but on a slant up into the ceiling. In one doorway there was a row of businessmen, some still with their briefcases, standing as they would have been, waiting for the train to stop, but all dead. Emergency workers spent like 6 days looking for survivors, and while the crash was eventually attributed entirely in the behavior of Newson during the final minute before the accident occurred, no motive or reason was ever found.
Number 10. Heloise and Abelard. We're going to start off with a banger. In 12th century Europe, the norm of your average society was very restrictive due to religion and its influences on the masses and political policies. Thus, a love affair between a theologian and philosopher Abelard and his younger student Heloise was very scandalous, and it challenged Parisian society like never before. The thin line between blind faith and logic was violated, and a consequence was about to hit Heloise and Abelard pretty hard, who, by the way, was already been married. The scandal happened when Heloise got pregnant, and when they both realized that would be unsafe for her to remain in Paris, they fled to Brittany, which was Abelard's birthplace. Heloise's uncle, Fulbert, canon of Notre Dame, and the one who had hired Abelard to be his niece's tutor in a scheme to protect her dignity only in his own mind, was the one who put an end to their love affair by having his servants castrate Abelard while he slept, which is pretty wild to think about. Sorry, Abelard. Abelard became a monk and dedicated his life to philosophy, while the heartbroken Heloise was forced by her uncle to give up the child for adoption and become a nun. The two were still deeply in love with one another, and despite them never ever seeing each other ever again, they still continued to write each other every single day. Their affection but sad love letters were then published and continued to touch thousands of people around this world today. Number 9. Queen Brunhild. Revenge is a dish best served cold, but of course if you try you might not be as successful. For someone perhaps best known for her means of death, Queen Brunhild thrived during an astonishing 70 years of reaping revenge for her sister's death, ruling through her husband as queen consort, seizing rule as regent for her sons, seizing rule again as regent for her grandsons, and then seizing rule as regent for her great-grandson. She won the friendship of Gregory the Great and Gregory of Tours and played a pivotal role in the Catholic Christianization of Francia. Ultimately though, it took every duke in 2 kingdoms and the United Kingdoms to defeat her forces in battle. When she and the nominal king were captured, he was executed pretty quickly, but for the queen, each of her limbs were tied to a different horse, which was then galloping off in 4 different directions. Number 8. Children's Crusade. No child should ever be used in adults' war. That is a fact, and it should be constantly reminded because history seems to be only left as a thing to be reflected on, and yet people still struggle to reflect. As in 1212, the unfortunate Children's Crusade occurred as a tragic event born out of religious fervor. The Children's Crusade involved thousands of young people, mainly young and adolescents, who was set out to reclaim the Holy Land. Their crusade ended in disaster, with many children dying from disease, starvation, and even eventually being sold to slavery. As for the adults who sent them, they just marked these children as martyrs or just doing their duty for God. Number 7. The Jacquerie was a peasant uprising in France as it was triggered by a social inequality and the hardships caused by the 100 Years' War and the Black Death. The revolt was named after the Jacques, a term used to refer to the French peasantry, and the Jacquerie was a violent and unorganized rebellion marked by widespread atrocities on both sides. The rebellion was brutally suppressed, but it exposed the deep-rooted social tensions and grievances of the medieval peasantry. The peasants were burdened by heavy taxes, feudal obligations, and a rigid social hierarchy that favored the nobility. The peasants were burdened by heavy taxes, feudal obligations and a rigid social hierarchy that favored the nobility. The devastating effects of the Black Death, a pandemic that swept through Europe and had reduced the population, has led to a shortage of labor and paradoxical increasing the bargaining powers of surviving peasants. The rebels targeted nobles, clergies, and anyone associated with the upper classes. As castles were sacked, aristocrats were brutally killed. The violence was often indiscriminated, marked by a desire for revenge. While the jacquerie did not lead to an immediate systematic change, it contributed to an ongoing tension between the aristocracy and the peasantry. The revolt highlighted the dissatisfaction of the lower classes and set the stages of future conflicts and social changes, which, to be honest, if you think about it, still occurs even now, and the thing is, they're just really good at hiding it. Number 6. Henry Liddell. Sometimes the horror of a death lies less in a method than its causes. Henry was reforming prior places in charges of a small struggling community of canons near Nottingham. During his leadership, or under his leadership, the canons clawed their way towards self-sustaining through legal and extra-legal means. Henry apparently found solace amidst the trials and poverty with a local woman, even making a new home with her. And when he and his canons were called back into the mother house, Henry refused to leave his lover. The monks showed up and forcibly kidnapped Henry back to Topolholm, and this proved lethally devastatingly to the poor monk. Henry's heart was smitten by melancholy. Had taken guidance from the devil, he had gone to a hot bath, opened veins in both of his arms, and in his way of his own free will, to no freely folly of ending his own life. He really wanted his girl. Number 5. Tristan and Isolde. The heartbreaking love story of Tristan and Isolde has been told and retold in various stories and manuscripts. Tristan met the love of his life after traveling to Ireland to ask for the hand of the beautiful princess Isolde in marriage, but on behalf of his uncle Mark, King of Cornwall, on their way back to Cornwall, Tristan and Isolde committed a fatal mistake and drank a magic potion which produced invincible and eternal love in anyone who had tasted it, apparently. Despite this, Isolde eventually married Mark of Cornwall, but she could not help but love Tristan eternally. The love affair continued after the wedding, but when King Mark finally learned about it, he banned Tristan from Cornwall. Tristan moved to Brittany and married another woman only because her name, Isolde, reminded him of his true love, Isolde. Despite both of them being married to other people, they never actually managed to get over each other, and their sad story ends with Isolde dying on Tristan's chest on what is known as one of the saddest love stories of medieval literature. Number 4. Great Schism. The Great Schism, also known as the Western Schism, was a prolonged crisis within the Catholic Church that lasted from 1378 to 1417. It was a split in leadership with the church, with the rival popes claiming legitimacy and excommunicating the other person. This schism had significant political, religious, and social consequences, and is considered one of the most serious crises in the history of the Catholic Church. The schism originated in 1378 with the election of two popes, Pope Urban VI in Rome and Pope Clement VII in Avignon. The division occurred due to the disputes of the legitimacy of the papal election and dissatisfaction with the Urban VI leadership style, and the Great Schism had a lasting impact on authority and prestige of the papacy. It also contributed to a broader questioning of the church's authority and set stage for the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. So why is it tragic? In some general senses, when it comes to faith, it is heavily essential for people to feel comfort, especially in the era of pre-technology and lack of enhancement gave people more fear. This division did lead to confusion, conflicts, and a loss of faith among the people, eroding the church's influence. Think of it like when you're downstairs and you gotta run up the stairs to your room, and when you turn off the light at night because you're afraid of a demon going to chase you. Do you know what I mean? No? It's just me? Okay, never mind. Number 3, Great Famine. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, often referred to as the Great Famine of the 14th century. It was a period of widespread food shortages and famines that affected most of Europe. This crisis had profound social, economic, and demographic consequences, and it was exacerbated by a combination of factors, including adverse wealth conditions, crop failures, and social economic pressures. The period leading up to the Great Famine experienced abnormal weather conditions, including heavy rainfall, cold temperatures, and these conditions were leading to poor harvests and widespread crop failures, particularly of grain crops such as wheat, oat, and barley. The failure of these crops resulted into a shortage of food of both humans and livestock. As a consequence, there was a decline in agriculture productivity, and the famine conditions spread throughout Europe. The scarcity of the food and rising prices led to social unrest and upheaval, as desperate populations engaged in various forms of protests, including riots, uprising against local authorities and landlords. The famine strained existing social structures, and there's accounts of even cannibalism and extreme desperation. The breakdown of social order in some regions contributed to a sense of fear and chaos, as the Great Famine had a long-term effects on Europe's society. It contributed to changes in agriculture practices, with some regions shifting from harder to more resilient crops, and it had implications of labor relations and the feudal system. As the scarcity of labor increased, the bargaining power of the survival workforce. Number 2, the Spanish Inquisition. Initiated by the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand II and Isabella I, the Spanish Inquisitions aimed to enforce religious unity and eliminate heresy, at least what they believed, which in all honesty is very tragic considering thousands of people, including Jews and Muslims and suspected heretics, were prosecuted, tormented, and executed during this very vile period. While initially focused on the conversos, the Inquisition scope expanded to include a wide range of individuals, including those suspected of practicing Judaism or Islam in secret. Protestantism and other forms of heresy were also included. The Spanish Inquisition is infamous for its use of torment and punishment during the interrogations. While torment was not always employed, its reputation had become a symbol of Inquisition's harsh methods. Those found guilty faced punishments ranging from fines and public penances to imprisonment and execution. The Spanish Inquisition left a lasting impact on the cultural and religious history of Spain, as it generated fear and mistrust within the communities, contributing to social and religious tensions, and had a significant influence on Spain's historical trajectory. And number 1. Honestly, this is a tragic but a very sweet one. There was once an emperor named Shah Jahan who was once arranged to marry Mumtaz Mahal when she was 14 and he was 15 years old. However, they had to wait a little bit because, you know, they were young and they had to wait to get older to get married. But due to political alliances, he would have to marry other women, but his love for Mumtaz was great. When they finally got married, they had an explosive, spicy romance that expression for their love gave birth to up to 14 children. Mumtaz was such an influence to Shah that she was basically his second in command, and she had a lot of influence as she would focus on the issues of the poor as well as the love of poetry and art. Unfortunately, while she was giving birth to her 14th child, she suffered from a prolonged labor that lasted up to 30 hours and died. Shah was devastated and was stricken with so much grief that he went to hiding for over a year. And when he returned to the public eye, he was all gray, his back was bent, and his face was worn from heartache. All while this was happening, he made a commission in honor for the love of his life, Mumtaz, by making the one and only monument and very popular spot of all India, the Taj Mahal, which translates to the Crown Palace, as Taj means crown and Mahal means palace. In a very sweet rhetoric though, and Mahal in other languages like Malay means expensive, but it also means love in Tagalog. After all, homes are expensive, but they are worth the price, because home is where the heart is, and to Shah, Mumtaz was definitely his home. Shah was then laid to rest next to his soulmate in 1666, where they are together forever in the Taj Mahal.